as we go along. Thank you all for joining us, Finmark Trust, to celebrate this important milestone in our journey. We are 20 years old this year. My name is Brendan Pierce. I'm the CEO of Finmark Trust. I will be taking us through today's agenda. We're celebrating 20 years by hosting a number of webinars to share our experiences and learnings over the last 20 years in financial inclusion and making financial markets work for the poor. As an evidence-driven organization, we believe it's important for us to learn from our practice, to be honest about what we have done well, what has worked, what has not worked. In development, that's the only way you get better, is through the honesty, but through sharing and through learning from your practices. 20 years, I guess in human terms, is not a long time. I guess if you were a young person out of your teens, entering early adulthood, you would just be starting your life's journey. In social and economic development terms, 20 years is also not a long time, although of course there's a lot more pressure given the number of development problems that we have. Finmark, we see Finmark Trust as an asset to a resource that belongs to the people of Southern Africa. It's a resource that is available to them to assist in the development, in the fight against poverty and unemployment. It does not belong to us. We are mere custodians of this institution. With those few words, I'm going to go into what our agenda looks like for the day, and I'm glad you joining us. I'm hoping we're going to share some interesting learnings that would inform your own work wherever you are. We're first going to start with a short video that was made by the team at Finmark Trust, trying to reflect and trying to capture some of what we've learned over the last 20 years. We will then move on to opening remarks by our chairperson, Mr. Kuvadia, who fortunately has been with Finmark from the beginning, from 20 years ago. He'll share some of his reflections on this period where we started, what our journey has been, and hopefully give us some idea about where we're going. We will then have a presentation by Jaco Vederman, who's our head of knowledge management, to just recap a brief evolution of financial inclusion and the lessons that we've learned over this time. After that, we'll have a panel discussion. We're very happy to have been joined by some of our fellow FSD CEOs, Tamara Cook, from the CEO of FSD Kenya, Eselina Makome, the CEO of FSD Mozambique, and John Bosco Yaku, CEO of Access to Finance from Rwanda. They're going to share with us some of their own learnings, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion about where the FSD network is at the moment and where it's going to. So that's what we have on the program for today. Mike, if you can just jump to house rules. So the house rules are you'll be muted by default, so you won't be able to unmute yourself. We will, however, make available an opportunity for you to post any questions that you have on the Q&A box. We have a team that will be trying to answer those questions as soon as they come up. Whatever we can't answer immediately, we will certainly get back to you. We will also share the recording and the presentations after this event so that you can go through it at your leisure. So with those opening remarks, I hope you enjoy what we have for you today. We will start with the video. Mike, you can take that.
Years ago, many products and services that form an inherent part of our retail financial landscape today simply didn't exist. Since then, Finmark Trust took the dream of making financial markets work for the poor and turned it into a practical reality. We do this through the development and implementation of regional and national financial inclusion strategies. We work with stakeholders to effectively track progress. Finmark's work is evidence-based, and data is crucial in informing policy and regulation, as well as effective monitoring and evaluation. 20 years ago, we launched the first FinScope survey in South Africa. Our nationally representative survey focused on the needs of consumers and small businesses for financial services. FinScope has now been completed in over 36 countries worldwide, with many countries regularly repeating the survey as part of their financial inclusion efforts. Over the past 2 decades, we have witnessed many financial market changes across Southern Africa. Finmark has worked with its partners in the region to achieve the following impacts. 48 million adults were included in the formal financial system in the last decade, 22 million being women. 4.4 million people benefit from lower cross-border remittance prices, 60% of them being women. Formal cross-border remittance transaction volumes have also risen by 69%. In the case of Lesotho, the price of sending remittances from South Africa has dropped over 70% in the past 5 years alone. New products introduced in this corridor now remits 1 billion rand a year. In the first 18 months of the adoption of the SADC regional mobile money guidelines, Malawi's 2.8 million mobile money wallet users received $1.6 million in interest payments, with the first being launched 5 years ago. As a result of these guidelines, the use of mobile money in the region is increasing, with people earning interest on their savings. We have supported people in the region who were affected by the COVID fallout by creating a migrant relief fund. With the direct support of the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO, the fund reached 12,500 families across 5 countries. Finmark Trust also successfully located and incubated 3 fintechs that showed promise to develop pro-poor solutions. They went on to raise $19.3 additional for each dollar FMT raised. These are just a few of the initiatives we support that are making a difference in the lives of our end beneficiaries, the poor and marginalized, particularly women. Looking forward, there is still much to be done. As inclusion rates across SADC countries continue to rise, so has account dormancy. This means that whilst people now have access to financial services, they are often not used. As we look forward to the next few years, we will focus on increasing the role that financial services play in people's lives by supporting the creation of financial services that have a direct link to economic growth and trade. This includes empowering consumers, particularly those that risk being left behind in an increasingly digital world, and by the development of a market that supports competition and innovation, enabling it to meet the needs of a changing African continent. Collectively, we term this Financial Inclusion 2.0. Financial Inclusion 2.0 is a natural continuation of the progress made within the financial inclusion community, led by Finmark Trust in the past 20 years. Where financial services were only accessible to the few in the past, they are now more widely available. It is time to ensure that this availability translates into meaningful change, ensuring better lives for all people.
I think we need to look at that evolving environment. I think we need to look at inclusion more broadly. I think we need to look at where are the people that benefited from FundMark's work up to now? Are they still in the system broadly, or are they outside of the system? If they're outside of the system, what do we need to do to bring them back in? I think that that's the mindset we need to have, in my view. That means working with business, obviously, but not just for the financial sector, but also working with government and others to see, does this need some sort of policy rethink? Does this need some sort of strategic thinking on how we, as we're rebuilding our economy, including into the system those that have actually fallen off, not just in the financial sector, but in the broader system. And I think FundMark has the history, has the experience of looking at bringing excluded people in. Concentrate on the financial sector, but I think we can, with a little bit of tweaking, begin to broaden that to how do we bring back into the system people that have fallen off. And I think that that's the future I would want to see.
Financial inclusion work now must result in people's livelihoods being made better. It must result in people getting jobs. It must result in people getting access to basic services. That is a complete mindset shift from us, and our new programming is going to focus on these areas. Our approach is to be evidence-based, be led by the evidence that we get from research, and we believe that's the best way to make policy, that's the best way to allocate resources. We will continue to be a partner to the donor world for those donors who are interested in the same objectives as ours, and they have played an immense role in the last 20 years of the trust. Thank you very much for that. I hope you enjoyed that short video clip. It was put together by an internal team of ours, including the narration was done by somebody from within our team. We will be making that video available to you as well. It's very difficult, as you know, to capture 20 years in a 7-minute video, but I think the team has done a good job. We're going to move on now to our chairperson, Mr. Kaskovadia, giving us his reflections. As I said, fortunately, he has been with us from the beginning and knows the history, I guess, more than any of us. Cas is also currently the CEO of Business Unity South Africa and was previously the Managing Director of the Banking Council of South Africa. And for his sins, he is also my boss. Cas, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you for the opportunity to just say a few words about FundMark Trust here. I'd just like to apologize if my photo is a bit odd. I haven't been well and I am literally doing this from bed, so please excuse the photo. Let me just very quickly dwell on some historical aspects of FundMark Trust. I was in the fortunate position when I was at the Banking Council, but we changed the name subsequently to Banking Association of South Africa, where I was approached by DFID, a guy by the name of Hugh Scott, who was a DFID representative here at that time. And Hugh told me that he wants to shift the way DFID does its work here. Instead of doing all sorts of small projects, he wanted to do a major project that makes a difference in people's lives. And he suggested that that project be something that makes financial markets work for the poor. He also said that he needs a private sector partner for this. And would the Banking Council at that time be willing to partner him? I thought it was a very good idea because making financial markets work for the poor is an essential element for the banking sector. My board initially was hesitant about this. They felt that this isn't something that's relevant to us, not something that we should be getting involved in. And you and I kept on pushing. Eventually, my board agreed. And we established Fundmark Trust. I remember interviewing David Porteous, who was the first chief executive officer of Fundmark Trust. And knowing David, one of his first questions was, what sort of boundaries are you gonna put around me? What sort of boundaries are the banks going to put around me? And my response to him was that, David, this is greenfield stuff, hasn't been done before. You create your own boundaries. You do what you need to do and make this thing work. And so we established Fundmark Trust. Initially, it was within the Banking Council of South Africa. It was essentially a project of the Banking Council of South Africa. As Fundmark Trust grew and it began to be seen to be a respected and credible research house, if you like, for financial inclusion, starting with the Funscopes. We had a discussion between Difford and I and the board of the Banking Council, and we felt that for Fundmark Trust to be credible, to be respected, to be seen to be the go-to place for financial inclusion, it needed to develop independence. And we decided to hive Fundmark Trust off from the Banking Council, establish it as a not-for-profit company with its own board. I served on the board as representing the banking industry, but we then had other people on the board outside of the banking industry, and Difford was on the board. And Fundmark started operating. So that was the history. What are some of the key milestones of Fundmark Trust? I think the fact that we hived it off as a separate independent body, and Fundmark Trust has maintained that independence. As the chair of Fundmark Trust currently, I am pretty clear that we need to guard that independence because it gives us credibility. It gives us a good standing. Some of the milestones in the last 20 years, in my view, was one, Funscope, which was extremely successful in South Africa. We managed to actually get it going in other parts of the continent. And today we have Funscope with financial inclusion studies in 36 countries around Africa, African continent, Asia, and Haiti. So Funscope has really grown and has become a global standard to measure financial inclusion and to guide financial inclusion. In 2010, we included regional financial integration in SADC to complement our financial inclusion work. This exposed us to the important agenda of cross-border payments and capital flows that poor people rely on because of our migration patterns in SADC in particular, and between South Africa and the other SADC regions. And that took us on the road to looking at how we deal with issues of enabling, given the migratory patterns in SADC, and enabling transfers of money from South Africa in particular to other parts of the SADC region. We've also made an impact on cross-border remittances, which is these transfers from South Africa to other parts of it, SADC and Africa, with some 70 billion rand flowing from South Africa to its neighbors annually to support poor families in the region. Prices have been reduced by more than 50% over the last decade, with new affordable products now on the market. And Fundmark Trust has played a leading role in causing that sort of interruption in this remittance market. We have also worked in support of SADC to develop the first regional financial inclusion strategy for SADC in 2017 and putting financial inclusion on the SADC agenda. And we continue to do a lot of work with SADC currently in financial inclusion. Internally, our drive for self-sustainability was driven by the uncertain donor environment, which forced us to change our business model from a complete reliance on one donor, which was different at that time, to diversifying our funding and have some of the data customers pay for the products we deliver. So we've diversified our funding. We've changed into a sort of project and program related organization where we raise funding for projects and programs, and we charge for some of our outputs. And I think the fact that we've got the credibility, the independence, we've been able to do that. So FinMark has undoubtedly played a pivotal role in promoting financial inclusion, in the implementation of financial inclusion models and products, in enabling financial institutions to develop a range of products for financial inclusion, in working with governments in South Africa and in the SADC region to put financial inclusion very firmly on the agenda, in enabling interruption in the financial markets as far as remittances is concerned, costs of products are concerned, and has developed a global respectability and credibility for the work that it has done. We've often talked about, given all the work that FinMark Trust has done and its successes, given that it has put financial inclusion on the agenda, given certainly in South Africa that we moved from figures for financial inclusion where before FinMark Trust, probably about 35 to 40% of bankable people had some form of bank accounts. Today, it's over 80% of bankable people that have some form of bank accounts. And so given the success of FinMark Trust, we've asked ourselves the question, is there still a role for FinMark? And we are absolutely clear that there is a role. We have embraced a concept of financial inclusion 2.0, which seeks to bring financial access closer to supporting local economic growth, access to employment, especially for women, access to markets, particularly with the signing and now hopefully implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We believe that financial inclusion needs to be pivotal to enabling trade relationships, particularly for small, medium enterprises. So we believe FinMark Trust has a lot of work to do, which builds on its success and builds on the fact that it has put financial inclusion at the center of the agenda. This new approach requires us to look more closely at how the poor earn their living and what the opportunities are for them to become employed either formally, informally, or through small and medium enterprises. We will partner with local institutions to adopt an integrated approach to supporting small business, small farmers, and other forms of income generating activity that people embark on to not just to survive, but also to grow. These partnerships are critical to the access of our program in the region. We will also focus on more on women who are the majority gender in areas such as cross-border remittances and informal cross-border trade. We will continue to be evidence-driven and continuously evolve our data tools to provide insights into the area of work we have been involved in. And we will continue to collaborate with all those organizations, governments, institutions interested in this area of work. And as Brandon said in the beginning, We don't claim proprietary interest over the work we do and over our outputs, and we are more than willing to share these and collaborate on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cass, for capturing 20 years in a few minutes. Yeah, I think you've given us great insights into how we started, where we come from, and where we need to be going. Thank you very much, and apologies again for getting you off your sickbed to come and join us. Thank you very much, Cass. We're now going to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the presentation of the evolution of financial inclusion and the way we have seen it, you know, from where we are. Yaku Vedaman, the head of our knowledge management unit, is going to do that presentation. Over to you, Yaku.
Great. Mike, if you can quickly stop sharing your screen so I can jump onto mine. Perfect. There we go. Great. I hope all of our participants can share my screen. So thank you all for taking some time to join us today for this discussion. So I've got the privilege of talking us a little bit through the evolution of financial inclusion, just as a concept, casting our minds all the way back to the 1980s. And I'll be positioning Finmark Trust within that. And after that, we'll share some of our learnings that we've had over the past 20 years or so of existence, followed by an opening up to the panel discussion, which Brendan will facilitate for us. So I want us to cast our minds first all the way back to the 1980s and think where this all sort of started. Financial inclusion only really became a term in the 2000s. But during the 1980s to 2000s, there was a lot of focus on microfinance. So providing credits, providing low-income people across particularly Southeast Asia with a hand up as opposed to a handout. So the idea was quite simple. If we provide credit to these people, they will be able to improve their own livelihoods and start to grow, delivering on some of that promise of economic growth. Now, the focus here was really on making sure that credit was provided to these people and that it could surge forward. There wasn't a lot of thinking really about the sort of ecosystem at that time. And what this meant is that credit, being as it is, was unleashed on a low-income population who, some of which succeeded. So many people succeeded and lifted themselves out of poverty, and many did not. The metaphor we can use here to try to understand how this all played out is a little bit like that of fire. Now, fire can help you keep your house warm. It can help you cook your food. It can also burn your house down if it's not used correctly. So what happened and what came out of this era of microfinance, which even extended further back than the 1980s, is we saw that credit can play a role. It can help as a development tool to alleviate poverty and to support economic growth. But if not managed well, it can also lead to very negative outcomes for the poor. I mean, one of the things that stuck in my mind is there was a spat of suicides at one point because people were so over indebted, couldn't get out of some of these traps that they were in, and essentially became what we might think of as indentured servants who were never going to be able to pay off this debt, who were always going to be paying the last cent that they find back to credit providers. So we saw during this era that, yeah, financial services can play a great role in terms of it as a development tool, but at the same time, it can be dangerous if not managed appropriately. So after that, the thinking became, okay, can we think a bit more broadly about this so we don't have all of these negative outcomes that often take place? And that's where the concept of financial inclusion started to become popularized, particularly by the World Bank and the United Nations system. So during this time, the thinking was really about moving towards building a broader ecosystem. So things like financial education, consumer empowerment, and consumer protection became very, very important during this time. Access to a more diverse set of products also became something that we really wanted to focus on as a broader financial inclusion community. For example, microfinance to assist with some of the risks that farmers in these Southeast Asian areas may face from floods or other things. So rather than just credit, it started to grow into something bigger and broader. And that was really where financial inclusion as a concept, the development of an ecosystem and providing access to that ecosystem became quite popular. It was during this time, 2002, so very early in this period, that Finmark Trust was founded in South Africa. And as Cass has just mentioned, that we launched our first FinScope. This was quite important because during this period from 2000 on to 2016 and still ongoing, the FinScope tool has been crucial at ensuring that work that is done in the financial inclusion community is evidence-based in its pro-poor efforts. So what we saw with microcredits is it can help, but it's also very damaging. And a lot of people didn't necessarily track that so closely. So you could see some small studies, randomized controlled trials that show that credit's great, but then in the broader context, it wasn't necessarily so perfect. So FinScope was an excellent tool, being nationally representative and lifting out a lot of those issues that consumers face as they get engaged with the formal financial services ecosystem. And as Cass has mentioned, Finmark Trust has contributed greatly in the development of the measurement and monitoring and evaluation of financial inclusion. Now, what we managed to achieve over this period was excellent. I mean, we really saw an ecosystem be built. We saw a lot of things put in place to protect low-income consumers and to make sure that they're not exploited. But as Cass has mentioned for us, we actually had a number of problems. So where we are at the moment from 2016, looking forward to 2022, is to start thinking not only about providing access to low-income consumers, many of whom now have access, but to start thinking about meaningful usage. And why we're thinking about that is quite important. I pulled some information here just to sort of help us frame the conversation from the World Bank and some of our colleagues at CGAP, or the Consultative Group Against Poverty, based in Paris. What we saw is that between 2011 and 2017, 1.1 billion new adults got access to a financial services account. So we can now say that approximately 69 to 70% of adults worldwide have accounts. But dormancy rates, as Cass has mentioned, surged forward as well. 25% of the accounts in the developing world have not been used in the past year, which is a very generous definition of dormancy. I mean, we would typically look at monthly levels, etc. What is more damning is that this is 50% when we look at India and sub-Saharan Africa. And what this tells us, or at least what it tells me as somebody active in the financial inclusion community, is that we have this great ecosystem. We've given people access, they have accounts, but it just sits on a shelf collecting dust. And sometimes even what we've seen coming out of our FinScope research is that people have forgotten that they have accounts. You'll even see a mismatch in the supply and demand side data, for example, where you say, well, we have more accounts, but people have forgotten about them. They actually don't even realize they still own the account. And what this has highlighted for us, and what we've started to do in 2016, 2017, through some of the support we received from the MasterCard Foundation and the Gates Foundation, is to start looking at the intersection of usage and real economic outcomes. So usage of financial services and people's livelihoods and being better off and their well-being. So we looked at all kinds of things like resilience, the ability to meet goals, etc., with the eye on the importance that we want to lift out here being that we want to make sure that this usage translates to better outcomes. In other words, very simply, it should lead to economic growth, and inclusive economic growth at that. So not just for sort of high income earners, but that we take the poor and the excluded along. Another one is to create jobs. And overall, we believe that through these two tools, in time, this will lead to a betterment of people's lives. Now, it's this specific change, moving away from just that access towards meaningful usage and meaningful engagement with the ecosystem, that we term financial inclusion 2.0. And that's really encapsulates the terminology which we use when we engage with our stakeholders and others in this space. Now, one thing that we found is quite useful is the momentum around the Sustainable Development Goals. It gives us an excellent way to anchor that usage into meaningful outcomes. So for example, financial services usage to reduce poverty, financial services usage to have zero hunger, financial services usage to support reduced inequalities, and importantly, to increase the participation of women in the economy as well. All of these things, the 16 development goals, are very important. And financial services can play an important role in those goals, many of them in different ways. Before we jump into the last part of my presentation today and then move on to the panel discussion, I really wanted to share that Finmark Trust is not just here on its own right. We're actually part of a family. We're one of 8, if you want to call it, one of 8 children in this regard. So we have colleagues across the continent and sister institutions, ranging from Access to Finance, presence in Rwanda, EFINA over in Nigeria. We, of course, have FSD Kenya in Kenya, FSDM or FSD Mozambique over in Mozambique, FSD Uganda in Uganda, and of course, FSD Zambia as well. Now, what makes us a common family is we were all founded on the same principle, and that principle is making markets work for the poor, or the M4P approach. And essentially, the M4P approach is all about creating sustainable market change that doesn't foster dependency. What do I mean by this? I essentially mean that we work with stakeholders to empower them. So if there's problems with the regulatory environment, and that's the reason that poor and low-income people are excluded, we will work with regulators to change the regulation, and then eventually with FSPs to launch sustainable products to serve this segment of the market. And then from there, we will exit. And this should then continue to exist and continue to operate in a pro-poor manner long after we've gone. This is a quite explicit approach in our mind that one day, we don't exactly know when, but one day the FSDs should be able to step back and say this market is now working well and in a pro-poor manner. So moving on to just a couple of lessons, there are two sort of clusters of lessons I wanted to share. One is really focused on our data journey because it's been such an incredible and important journey for us. And the other one is then sort of overarching lessons that we've learned in the past 20 years. So as we've mentioned already, the first FinScope was launched in 2003, right after Finmark Trust was officially spun off from the Banking Association. And it was an incredibly important tool because it brought the challenges that the low-income consumer faces into sharp focus. And it allowed everyone, not only Finmark Trust, from our own programmatic efforts in determining what we're going to do to drive pro-poor market change, but also our stakeholders. For example, in South Africa, entities like National Treasury, the Reserve Bank, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, which at the time obviously was set up differently. We have now recently implemented the Twin Peaks framework. But long story short, all of our stakeholders were rallied around this voice of the poor being expressed through FinScope, which is of course nationally representative and one of the deepest surveys of its type. Now, over time, we started to roll out the FinScope surveys further across SADC and even further afield in Southeast Asia. And it's at this time that the surveys became a key partner to bring out the demand side perspective within the Making Access Possible program of the United Nations Capital Development Fund. Now, this program really looks at creating national financial inclusion strategies and roadmaps for countries. And with FinScope being the constant way that we express the perspective of the consumer, of the person we're trying to help, this became inextricably intertwined alongside the supply side and sort of traditional desktop research done, alongside the regulatory interviews. And over time, this means that FinScope became embedded into the national financial inclusion environments of many countries, South Africa included, where we conduct FinScope yearly. Other examples include Botswana, Mozambique, who's recently conducted a FinScope as part of the M&E efforts of its own national financial inclusion strategy. And so FinScope has really become a data tool to lift out the voices of the poor and the marginalized. And as we look forward, where are we going now with some of this work that we're doing within FinScope? And we'll increasingly be looking at how usage is going to translate to real meaningful outcomes. So if we think of our MSME work and our MSME surveys, it's about finding those MSMEs that are capable of absorbing, for example, credits, that are hooked into digital ecosystems, and understanding how we can support them. What do they need from a financial inclusion perspective to grow, to take more of their employees along as perhaps a way to include them in the formal financial services sector, and then also to generate more jobs. So those are the types of things we are going to be focusing on in our data environment in particular. The next set of items I wanted to share a little bit on are just some of the overarching lessons we've learned, not focusing on any particular theme, for example, remittances, etc. But essentially, I want to just share some of these lessons. Now, the first is that you need consistent effort to drive meaningful impact. If we think about this movement from microfinance to financial inclusion and to what we're now calling financial inclusion 2.0, it really has required consistent effort and learning for us to move there. I mean, as we saw, okay, we had the situation with credits that people were being exploited. There's a lot of things we need to do to put in place to protect consumers from those types of problems. But now we see that credit's being taken for all kinds of things. We have still got a couple of problems with over-indebtedness, and it's lost a lot of its ability to drive, for example, real meaningful change through usage. So there's a continuous learning process here as we've moved through all of this time where we realize what it is that needs to take place. Where we are at the moment is we've realized that a consistent and integrated effort is really needed. to make financial markets work for the poor. It can't just be building a beautiful ecosystem. And in South Africa, we have a very well regulated financial services ecosystem, but it can't just be that. It needs to link back into the lives of the poor as a development tool. The second one is that local champions, or that we are a local champion, and our local presence has been incredibly valuable, not only for us, but for many of our donor partners as well. What we have noticed in the past with some of our work is very, very highly trained and technically savvy people have come in from countries outside of the region and have offered us a lot of very interesting and important advice, for example, coming from Europe and North America. But what we've noticed during that time is that, as well-intended as a lot of this is, it misses the local context. So what we as Finmark Trust have been doing is playing that role to be that bridge in the local context and local environment, because we consistently engage with regulators, we consistently engage with policymakers, and we regularly collect data like the FinScope surveys. I think all of the FSDs have their own sort of data collection efforts and often partner with Finmark on this. And of course, we're obviously engaged with the FSP. So we know our market, and we play an important translator and localization role for development efforts that, to state it bluntly, have not always been as successful when implemented from a distance. Now, the third one is that you need to really create the capacity to move from insights to action. Because what we've seen is that even though we put all of this data on the table, we put the analytics on the table, and we even go further, sort of creating recommendations for what stakeholders need to do, there's the gap. It reminds me of the subway trains in Europe, etc., when they always tell you, mind the gap, don't put your foot in there, you'll fall. And that's exactly what we've picked up here, is that there is a gap between all of these insights, even a well-intended plan, and actually pro-poor market change. So what we've done is we've created a programs team, which at Finmark Trust focuses very heavily on the implementation component, so that we're not just a set of very intelligent people sitting in a talk shop, but we're actually supporting that implementation through providing technical assistance, through providing coordination, and sometimes even providing memory, as you'll see partners within government change. So you might have, for example, new people take up a position within government. And in that sense, we're often the institutional memory that keeps the market moving towards those pro-poor outcomes. And the last one I wanted to share here is that a lot of times impact takes a lot longer than most of our stakeholders have patience for. And I'm going to jump into one example around remittances for us. So we're going to think a little bit about the Lesotho corridor, and we've seen a little bit of the achievements in that corridor in the video, which we shared earlier with everyone. Initially, when we started there, it was all a rules-based approach for remittances. In other words, do you meet these requirements? Do you have these documents? Else you may not be included in the system. As that moved to a risk-based system, we had to work very hard with FSPs and others to prevent them from excluding the low-income people, because they were just perceived as risky. We don't know what they're up to. We don't know why they're sending the money. Let's push them out. We had to work very hard to make sure that in that transition, the poor were not simply disregarded wholesale, essentially. After that, we had to work very hard to lift out the business case of why this is a good idea. Why should you move into this market, and show people that actually there's a huge informal market for remittances that they could capture if they build a viable product for them. And over time, we continued to highlight that using our data tools. Once we had some of our stakeholders bite, we then had to work with them, particularly the FSPs, to start developing products that are going to work. And the first of those products was launched 4 years ago. Today, it remits R1 billion a year at some of the cheapest rates anywhere in the world. And that is really where the impact is now hitting the road. So we can say there are thousands of people, particularly women in Lesotho, who can now receive much more money than they did before to spend on the things which they need to spend on because of that lower cost remittance channel. But that took 10 years. And often a lot of our partners are willing to sort of partner with us for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years. And what we need to think about, and it's a lesson for us, is how do we continue to deliver that impact, meet the needs of our partners that have been supporting us with a lot of, well, very gracious support up to date, and then help understand that there's a bit of patience that needed before that impact really hits the system. Now, looking forward, and I'm going to move over to my last slide. Apologies, we have a slight technical difficulty. One more. So where I'm going to conclude before handing over to Brendan to engage with our fellow FSDs is just looking forward in terms of what remains for financial inclusion. Many of us will be aware that there is a a war going on in Ukraine, and it's an absolute humanitarian disaster for everyone affected by it in the region. But there are also knock-on effects, for example, around food security. I read this morning that the government of Tunisia is now forced to ration wheat and bread, and there's a bit of a crisis in that sense, because they imported a lot of their wheat from Ukraine. I imagine a world where financial inclusion and financial services could support some of our farmers, some of our MSMEs, to rapidly scale up their production if they're already linked into digital systems, so that we can locally start meeting some of that, that shortcoming or that slack that has appeared in the market for food security. So this is the type of thing that we really increasingly want to focus on. If we think about trade and integration, I mean, as we've heard earlier, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is now entering into full swing. Is there a way we can, for example, use cross-border remittances rails that we've used in the past to support families to maybe see if we can't switch those around to support informal cross-border traders? It's a bit of a different target market, but using those same rails and infrastructure, which we've spent such a long time building together with our partners. And another one I thought of here is just to empower MSMEs to create jobs. So locating those MSMEs that are the most ready to absorb, for example, credit, that are the most ready to become digital MSMEs, that can access, for example, digital platforms and the financial services that go alongside that, so they can access bigger and broader markets, so that we can support them in this access to markets. And through that, they can assure decent work and economic growth, reductions in poverty, and hopefully reduce inequalities, because MSMEs are one of the best vehicles to support us all as we seek to create inclusive economic growth, rather than that sort of top-heavy focus on minerals economic growth, which doesn't trickle down as much as we would like. So I'm going to stop here with my presentation and hand over to Brendan to introduce some of our FSD CEO colleagues. And then we'll possibly hand over to FSD Mozambique to just share a quick couple of insights they have with some of these slides they've prepared. Thank you all for your time, and I hope we're going to have a fruitful discussion in a few moments. Mike, over to you again with the screen share. So I'm going to...
Thank you very much, Yaku, for that input and those insights. I think these are learnings. We have many, many more learnings, but these are the few that, you know, are kind of overarching ones. This is our view of the world, and please feel free to engage with us on your experience of how this has developed and where we are at the moment. Moving along swiftly to our panel, if I can ask my panel to switch on their cameras so that we can see them, that'll be great. So as I said, we've got 3 panelists. I'm not going to be a part of the panel. We've talked a lot about FinMark already. I wanted us to talk about the other FSDs. So I said we've got Tamara Cook, CEO of FSD Kenya. Tamara is also, by the way, the chair of the FSD Council. We have a council that represents all of the FSDs. We have got Eselina Makome from Mozambique, CEO of FSD Mozambique. Jean Bosco Ayachu is the CEO of Access to Finance Rwanda, and is the vice chairperson of the FSD Network Council. So those are my leaders in the FSD network. We will start, we're gonna allow each of the panelists to talk about their experiences first, in general, what have they learned, what has worked, and then we'll come back with some specific questions. So Eselina, apparently you've got slides that you want to share with us. If you can put those up, we'll start with you. I'm giving you 3 minutes.
Okay. Okay.
So that we get through. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, FinMark Trust, and congratulations for these 20 years. Really, your 20 years in somehow they have linkage with our journey on financial inclusion. As you mentioned, we are all sisters, and all of us who are working for using the approach M4P. I just want to highlight it what we in Mozambique, we have just only 7 years, and really we are now in the process of transforming FSD to the independent unit and no more program or project based. I will highlight it first, the results that we are seeing here coming from the FEN scope. Our first FEN scope was done in 2009. And if you see what's happened 10 years ago, it's really showing that our exclusion is reduced in somehow. But the most important here is that we see that the other formal non-bank institutions are the ones that have contributed to this reduction of exclusion. So this one make us thinking that really the digitalization, the digital should be considered as the driver of the financial inclusion. Because if you see the traditional in the banking, the increase for that side is very slow. So for us, within the financial, at FSD, digitalization, innovation, and use of technology is in the middle of our work. And working with the regulator was also part of our exercise. And based on these two components, working with the regulator, having technology, and seeing that the digitalization also contributes to financial inclusion, we have contributed in the development of the fintech ecosystem in Mozambique. And based on that, we were able to work with the regulator to create a regulatory sandbox, where it is a place where regulators interact with those innovators and the fintechs in order to see what are the policy or regulation that might handle innovation. So I want to highlight that one was the most important. I will not go to the rest, assuming the time, but now we are looking mostly on the market, capital market development, because we do believe that we have to move also for financial inclusion in the level of access, but moving to the usage, but mostly to move to what these users is making a difference to work or to the life of the people. So moving, as Jaco was saying before, to this financial inclusion 2.0. I will stop here and then continue the discussion, but really the general financial inclusion have some connection in different of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eselina. We will get Tamara next from FSD Kenya.
Great, thanks. And congratulations again on your 20 years. Although as I was giving Brendan a hard time before when we were preparing, FSD Kenya actually has similar roots to Finmark Trust, and Hugh Scott, who your chairman mentioned, was also involved in the early days of FSD Kenya in 2001, when FSD Kenya was a project inside of it. And we were created as an independent trust in the special purpose vehicle in 2005. So stay tuned for our 20-year anniversary in a few years.
Yes.
You know, FSD Kenya has had, I think, a really interesting journey over its founding, and really very similar to some of the things, Brendan, that you've already been talking about in terms of what makes a market facilitator work. And, you know, I often find it difficult to explain to people what I do. No, we're not really an NGO. No, we're not directly providing financial services. We're facilitating the development of a market so that the market provides micro and small enterprises and women and low-income households with those financial services. As I was thinking about what to share, there's so many different things I could share, but building on what Eselina did, in Kenya, we don't have FinScope, we have FinAccess, but let's face it, it's essentially the same tool. Kenya just wanted to give it its own name. And when we first did FinAccess in 2006, Kenya's formal financial inclusion was at 26%. Since that time, it has risen dramatically. And in the last survey, which we just launched in December, it was at 83.7% formal inclusion. Now that includes banked, and mobile money and digital financial services have been a really big part of the story in Kenya. And happy to talk more about that within the panel. Because you talked about the FinScope journey, I'd like to talk about our FinAccess journey a little bit, which is in the beginning, FSD Kenya worked with partners always to do it, but really led on it. And what we've seen is an evolution where the Kenyan government really owns this FinAccess data set. The Central Bank of Kenya and the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics implement it, launch it, run it. FSD Kenya is just part of the partnership, just like many others. And that's a great example of the sustainability of a data that's really important for informing policy. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we were in a room with a lot of the policymakers thinking about what are the implications for the latest FinAccess survey to inform policy going forward. A few years ago, we had a case study done on FSD Kenya, and it was done by the late Alan Gibson. May he rest in peace. And as I was thinking about what to prepare for today, I just wanted to share a couple of the insights from that, and I'll share a link in the chat for those who might be interested in that study. And what he found was that in that survey, and it's always nice to have somebody else do an analysis. And what I love about that study is he highlights some of the strengths, but also the things that we've gotten wrong and the things that we've had to change and learn along the way, because market systems development is not easy. It's not a straight path. It's try something and fail and as you go. Anyway, what he said that the key factors that have driven FSD Kenya's success are the quality of our people. And I know I'm biased, but I think we have a great team. Our independence and neutrality. And I think this is really important. And Brendan, you were talking about this earlier with Finmark, you know, in the banking association, but not in the banking association, in a donor, not in a donor, but really being seen as an independent and neutral convening platform. Importantly, we are analysis and knowledge led. So let data and insights and research inform, not opinions. We're flexible. You know, it doesn't have to be this mechanism or that mechanism. It's looking at what does the market need? What's stopping the market from developing? And how do we put in that secret sauce or special sauce to help the market move to the next level of development? Longevity. I think a lot of donor projects can be very short-term in their approach. And FSD Kenya has had the privilege of taking a long-term view. And I think for market systems development, that's really important. We're playing the long game here. Even though we want those quick wins, it's really about long-term change. And then finally, a culture of closeness and engagement, really being networked within the private and public sector so that people know that we are kind of a go-to place if they want to figure out how to get to that next level of market systems development. There's a lot more I can say, but Brendan, let me leave it at that.
Thanks for that, Tamara. I guess there'll be a toss-up about who's older between ourselves. But we look forward to your...
So I'm just, you know.
We look forward to your official 20-year celebration. Thank you very much for that. Ayachu, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Brendan. Just to echo my colleagues, congratulations on the 20 years anniversary. And we look forward to, I mean, we just, I think, achieved 10 years last year. And I think most of us have been in this sector, and we are finding it quite fulfilling in terms of the contribution that we are providing to the different economies that where we are present as FSDs. And I just touch base on some few aspects. I think a lot has been said, but really in Rwanda, there's something that I see very critical when you talk about a market catalyst or facilitator like AFR. So whenever there is a challenge, you need someone to be always there to keep this agenda, or I mean, the agenda, I mean, keep the problem on the agenda, or ensure that stakeholders are always thinking about that particular development challenge. And I think that's what we do in the respective markets where we are. And I would trace this back to the year 2008, when we did our first FinScope survey. Clearly, more than half of the adult population was excluded from the financial ecosystem. And that was a big problem for everyone. Policymakers really were finding it hard to justify such kind of figure. And clearly, when you look at it, that particular survey was really championed by, I mean, UK and the government of Rwanda, just to make sure that there is data, and then from evidence, formulate some of the policies and strategies going forward. And that's when AFR was born in 2010. Then formal kind of launch was in 2011. And that was, I think that was a game changer, because being there and ensuring that there's a track every 4 years through the skill scope survey was very critical, because progress would be measured and responsibilities would be established by different stakeholders within the sector. So that's, I'm very proud that we have humbly contributed to this growth that we have in Rwanda, where 93% of the adult population can access and use financial services. So I wouldn't say that it's quite rosy with 93%. There are still some of the challenges that need to be tackled. And I think this has been said in different markets. I think Yako covered it very well. Really, when you look at it, inclusion is not equal for all. I mean, there are those segments that still need to actually access and use financial services. We talk about women, youth, refugees, persons with disabilities, and so on. Smallholder farmers, but also some sectors. And those are productive sectors that are employing majority of our populations, but are not, they are very starved of credit. And how do we continue with such a status? So I'll talk about agriculture sector, manufacturing, all of those are still lacking some capital that would actually steer their growth and contribute hugely. One key aspect as I conclude is really the potential of technology. I think we've seen technology changing the landscape of the financial sector. We've seen different, non-traditional players. Yesterday I was reading where, in Nigeria, I think the central bank has licensed MTN mobile money to offer banking services. I know there's here in Rwanda, MTN is registering, I think they have registered a subsidiary that is actually focusing on payments and digital financial services. So that's a landscape that we need to watch, but also support to see whether those segments that are still unserved or underserved can be covered. And I wouldn't close without saying that the effects of COVID-19 are there, and you can't talk about development finance if you are not really supporting economies to recover from the pandemic and ensuring that we go back to some of the growth trajectories that were being paved across different African economies. So thank you. Over to you, Brenda.
Well, thank you very much, Ayachu, for that. There's so many things so many topics that we could jump into, but with the time, I just wanted to tease out a few issues. The one is related to Tamara. You were saying this is a long game that we're playing, and market system development it takes a long time. That's certainly been our experience. I have been asking myself the question as to whether that's still the right approach in the context that we're in now. We've seen over the last, I guess, 5 or 6 or maybe 10 years, the introduction of this concept of impact investment coming into our space. So there's one of our donors the other day, we're having a conversation, and she was saying to me that they're not focusing on market development now, they're focusing on creating a fund of funds to have that impact investment put in. They think that will have quicker results than the market system development. Is the market M4P approach, is it still the right approach? And given the impatience to solve the unemployment problems, the issues around basic services, is M4P still the right approach that we should be using? I'll start with you. Actually, let's start from the other way, from the back and move that way.
Yes, thank you, Brendan. That's a really very vital question. At this juncture for FSDs. And I'm really, I don't know why you asked me first, but I'm a firm believer in market system development approach, which really is very critical. And why is it needed and will continue to be needed in the future? I believe that most, if not all, development programs are meant to address specific market failures. Otherwise, if markets were working efficiently and poor people were benefiting from the growth and economic development that we are seeing in some parts of the developing countries, then probably no development programs would be needed because of those market failures. Then you need to come with an approach that will look at the entire ecosystem, understand the failures at different stages and aspects within the market. And I will talk about the regulation. Is it the supply side or the demand side? And I've found that the MSD approach really tackles that appropriately, looks at all those root causes that really are creating systemic cycle for poverty in these markets. And we've seen that if you don't do that, you'll be actually addressing symptoms rather than root causes of those problems that we see in the markets. I just pause there so that probably I can be contradicted by my colleagues here.
Sure, I wasn't picking on you. It was just the order that's reversed now. So Tamara is next. I mean, Tamara, do you think these approaches, the kind of impact investment approach, is contradictory to the M4P approach? Because they seem to be coming in at the same time. Sorry, Tamara, over to you.
Sure. I'd just like to agree with everything Iyachu just said. And so I will definitely not contradict you. I think those are really important points. As we think about impact investing, I think impact investing is a great thing. But do you know how it works? It works because the market system is at a level that impact investors can come in. If the policy and regulation is not there, if the data is not there, impact investing will have limited impact in what it does. I mean, we're never meant to be permanent entities. Market systems development is meant to get a market to a certain level, and then hopefully we can, end. And I think that bringing in, blended finance, impact investing could be part of that next solution. I mean, at FSD Kenya, we're really passionate about green finance and the potential for green finance for Kenya. And there's a lot of impact investing in that space. But understanding what the policy barriers are and the capacity gaps and the data barriers are, that's critical for enabling that impact investment to come in. Sure. So I don't see them as contradictory at all. In fact, I think it's more about who does what and how you use those.
Should they be, from a programming perspective, should they be done together? Because what I see at the moment is in many institutions, they're done completely separately by separate institutions. And the link to the market development work, as you say, is a critical one for the success of the impact investment that happens. And the local knowledge and understanding that needs to be fed into impact investment decisions. Should they be done together, or is the way they're doing at the moment?
It's a good question, and I'd like to say both. Either, I'm not sure. One challenge is if the impact investor is also trying to do market systems development, they may not be seen as that neutral convening player, right? And so how do you make sure that whoever's doing that market systems development is doing it with low-income people, the long-term view in mind, not a particular deal or a particular equity investment that we're trying to get a return on. And so I think you'd want to be careful in how to structure that so that the neutrality of market systems development and the focus on low-income people and micro and small and medium enterprises and green transition is there. Yeah, I think that's probably important.
Good. Eselina, I'm sure you'll agree with them. So I'm going to ask you the next question to go on to the next question. And it's just, what's next? We talked about 2.0. Tamara, you said you don't like the term 2.0. for FSD Mozambique, where are you, is 2.0 becoming something that you're implementing? What implications is it having for your institution, your programming, the approaches that you use?
Thank you, Brendan. But maybe before I go direct to that question, I just want to say some things about the previous points that was discussed related to M4P and the investment, impact investment. The view that we're taking in here at the FSD is that both are necessary, and depending on the level of development. Where we are at the moment, we really need the M4P approach in order to create a strong base so that when an impact investor is coming, if you can see, we are talking about the capital market and green finance, but you need before to have the M4P approach. So I am not seeing both as one against other or one or other. I see that both are necessary, and it will depend at which level of development the country is and also the organization. We can discuss if it should be the same entity that having the two approach. This is the way that we might discuss how to implement. But I think both are necessary, and in somehow those impact investment that can also help to bring the poor with more usage and also help with that to improve the quality of life. So going to the question about financial inclusion 2.0 and where we are and how do we see that in Mozambique, I think that from the definition or also for the journal of financial inclusion, all of us will understand that the financial inclusion cannot be stopping in the issue of access. We need to move on to that level of usage. And the point is how you create the usage, particularly for those low-income people. And that one is the critical elements, how financial service providers are really understanding the needs of those segment of population, and they're creating the level of service that they can use in order to improve their life. I think the challenge will be here. The other challenge that I'm seeing is that all of us will say that technology will be an enabler in this process. And the question, how do we have people with enough and good skills to develop these new innovative products? What are we doing in order that the market have those people that really, at the end of the day, will make financial inclusion working for the economy itself? So I see some challenges, and here in the challenge that I'm seeing also is coming that this issue of moving financial inclusion to 2.0 will require other players to come. For instance, I do think that academia needs to come to that debate, because if we're talking about skill, if we're talking about usage of technology, if we're talking about innovation, the academians that will have to also to say some things in this discussion, and not just leave it for within the financial service provider and the institution like ours. So it's what I can say at the moment. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you very much, Eselina. Tamara, you said you don't like the term 2.0. We'll have to sort that out later in our council meetings. But do you think that, does this mean the concept of integrated development that was all the rage, I don't know, about 15 years ago, is making a comeback? Because essentially that's what we're saying. We need to integrate what we are bringing to the table with what others are doing, so that the outcomes are more closely linked to the outcomes that people need: jobs, economic development, all of those things. Is that what we're seeing happening? The pendulum is swinging back to integrated development.
The pendulum swings back and forth in development all the time. Yes. I think what is really important when we think about Kenya, we started measuring financial health a few years ago. And what we've seen is, since we first started measuring financial health alongside financial inclusion, is that even though financial inclusion was going up, financial health continued to go down. And that points us to the problem that finance may be reaching people, but it's not doing enough good in their lives. And so what we've, across the FSD network, we've all been focused on finance for what? What is it going to do? And finance is never the end. Nobody cares about finance. Nobody wakes up thinking about finance, well, except maybe all of us. They think about what finance can do. It can help me with my farm. It can help me with my business. It can help me fund my child's education. It can help me not forgo medicine when I need it. And so I think what we need to all do, and Jaco talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, is think about how can finance enable those Sustainable Development Goals rather than how can finance make it happen.
Great. Ayachu, you want to add anything to that? I wanted a last question that I wanted to slip in. Ayachu?
Yes,
you want to add on to that?
Yes, I have something to add, really.
Okay.
I think in addition to what has been said, we've seen kind of a mismatch. This morning I was analyzing data, from the central bank, trying to see where actually capital is flowing in the economy. And you find that most of the intermediaries in markets, obviously they are looking at the bottom line, so they will look at less riskier or actually portfolios with an acceptable risk level, sorry, and actually channel financing there. And I've seen in our market clearly a lot is going into mortgage and trade, general trade. Yet you have really more than 80% of the population that is actually employed in the agriculture sector. We have manufacturing sectors. All of those sectors are really not getting the right capital for them to develop further. Now, should we continue with such kind of standards? So what we are, what the question we're asking ourselves as market facilitators is saying, how do we come in and really catalyze that change that is required so that really the players in the market or the financial market actually supports that, that fueling of flow of capital to the right sectors that will create more employment and decent employment, I would say, and really provide those basic services that Jaco talked about. Is it health? Is it education, shelter, affordable housing, clean energy? Are we seeing that? Are we seeing finance flowing towards that? So that's the big question we need to ask ourselves. And that's the clear alignment to the SDGs, I believe.
Thank you very much. With the short little time we have left, I wanted one more question. And the question relates to the sustainability of FSDs. We've had a number of shocks ourselves. After COVID, we've had huge changes in funding priorities. Funding was pulled away from FSDs, which plunged us into a bit of crisis. I'm sure many other non-profit organizations say this same fate. As Finmark, we have in 2017 changed our model around sustainability, as our chair said. We wanted to diversify our funding base. We looked at getting our clients to pay for some of the data products so that we're not reliant on donors for that. And we've also taken the step to look at doing advisory work in areas that intersects with what our objectives are as a way of diversifying our revenue base so that we can be more sustainable. Now, I guess from an M4P perspective, you will say we should be working ourselves out of a job. The question for me is, when do you close? Do you close when the job is done? Or do you close when the donor stops giving you money to do your work? That's an important question for me. Tamara, I'll start with you.
Sure. Look, it's a complicated one. And as you know, we've also faced our highs in terms of donor funding. We see ourselves as a special purpose vehicle and a market facilitator. And we do expect that we will close at some point. I don't know when that will be, but in our current strategy, which just started this year and ends in 2026, we wrote into the strategy an assessment to determine, is this the last strategy? And if not, how does FSD Kenya move towards that end as a market facilitator, given the stage of Kenya's financial sector development? It's a little different than the approach you've taken, Brendan. I think what we've tried to do is maintain the principle of a long-term view in a market systems development, even if the funding sources have changed in their nature.
Sure, thank you. Eselina?
Yeah, that question, Brendan, is at the moment, since last year, a great question within our FSD Mozambique, due to the cutting that we had, and we were not knowing if how we're going to continue surviving without donor. And based on that, we start to discuss how to diversify our funding resource for the activities. Due to the fact that for us it was clear that our role cannot stop because one donor has stopped. But we ask ourselves, if all donors stopped, what is going to happen? How do we make ourselves sustainable as an independent and local organization? And we have been thinking in two different ways. First is that we want to maintain our role of facilitating and promoting financial inclusion, but at the same time, we're trying to identify some of our activities that can generate funds from us. And also we are taking the approach, we're thinking on the approach that we have been giving to our partner as a grant, if those one can also change. So that we are still discussing our fundraising strategy, but for sure, I don't think that we can only rely on donor sources, all source of funds to continue our activities, because we think that we're still relevant in that space of financial inclusion, in particular in the way that we see financial inclusion. So it is a question that still open.
Thank you, Ayachu. You have the last word on this one.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, it's quite, I just wanted to make this statement. I think it's very dangerous for a catalyst to become part of the equation in chemistry. So when the catalyst becomes part of the equation, then, I mean, the whole transformation won't happen. And that's I think, something that is quite critical for us as market facilitators or market catalysts. So I would agree with Tamara that really, I mean, we are set up as a special purpose vehicle, really to drive, to catalyze the change. And I consider ourselves as a conductor in an orchestra. So that conductor is there to ensure that the market or the different people within that orchestra are doing the right thing so that actually the melody comes out very well and everyone can enjoy that. So that now the problem is when you you go back and start playing, then you have lost it. So the whole melody will be messed. Now, but I understand, I also understand the challenge that is there with donor funding. I think something that we need to continuously put forward is really to look for like-minded development partners and donors who understand what we stand for, but also who actually understand the status of the different markets where we are. I believe that when you have access, we've talked about access. We are moving to meaningful usage and quality financial services or solutions in the market. But I believe there are also other steps thereafter, like market sophistication. You look at the African continent, especially in the sub-Saharan African region, most of the capital markets are not yet developed. So that's a need. How do you get long-term capital or alternative financing in the market? So all those are needs, and I believe we are still there to support. But the issue is, how fast can you get donors who understand that status, but also is willing to support you and walk the journey with you? I think it's an open conversation, as Selina said, but we shall continue believing in who we are and continue talking to those that would actually understand what we do and the right cause we are behind.
Thank you very much for that, Ayachu. Yeah, this is going to be an ongoing debate, I think, in the FSD network. I think it's an important debate. We live in a world of many contradictions, and I think that's the context that we need to move into. I want to thank you for my panel for this, great discussion that we had. Again, I wish we had more time, but unfortunately, we've run out of time now. So thank you very much for joining and giving us interesting insights. We've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us. We will have a series of other webinars throughout the year on topics such as cross-border remittances, on digitization. We'll be unpacking some of these topics as part of our celebration. Of course, you can't celebrate without having a party, and those who are around South Africa will enjoy a party towards the end of this year as well. And maybe we'll invite some of the panel to come and join the party as well in Johannesburg. Thank you very much for this, and we hope we'll send you the presentations and the video, and thank you very much for joining us again. We look forward to chatting with you going forward around these important learnings and topics. Thank you very much.